Never go camping in the forests on reservations. Back when I was 13, my family lived in the city, but every summer I visited my relatives on the reservation. It was a tradition that had been going on since I was little. On this occasion, I was especially excited because I would get to spend more time with my cousins, Daniel, who was 14, Mia, who was my age, and little Jonah, who was 11. Their home was nestled deep within the woods, surrounded by towering pines and the sounds of nature. It was a world away from the city life I was used to. The air was fresh, the nights were quiet, and there was a sense of peace that's hard to find anywhere else. One evening after dinner, the four of us were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. The adults were inside, chatting and laughing about whatever. Daniel turned to us with a mischievous grin. "Guys, what if we went camping tonight?" Mia raised an eyebrow. "You know, Grandma and Grandpa wouldn't let us do that. They've told us 1,000,000 times not to go into the woods after dark." "Exactly," Daniel smirked. "That's why we won't tell them a thing." I could tell Jonah didn't like the sound of that. I don't know. What if we get caught? I was torn. The idea of a nighttime adventure sounded great, but disobeying our family didn't sit right with me. "You know, we could just ask first," I added. Daniel shook his head. "They'll just say no. Come on, it'll be fun. We'll set up a tent, tell stories, and we'll be back before sunrise, before they even know." Mia glanced at me. "What do you think, Alex?" I was hesitant, but then I thought about how memorable it could be. At the time, all the kids my age were saying YOLO. "All right, I'm in, but we have to be careful." Jonah sighed. "Fine, but if we get in trouble, it's on you, Daniel." We waited until everyone had gone to bed. Around midnight, the house was quiet, except for the soft sounds of our grandparents snoring. We grabbed what we needed and sneaked out the back door. The night was clear, and the moon cast a soft glow through the branches. The paths we knew so well during the day now felt creepy, which made it all the more exciting. After about 20 minutes, we found a small clearing near a creek, a spot we'd visited many times before. But at night, it felt like a whole new place. We worked together to set up a tent, though it was a bit of a struggle in the dark. Once everything was ready, we sat around a small battery-powered lantern. The soft light illuminated our faces, and the sounds of the forest added to the atmosphere, crickets chirping and the occasional owl hooting in the distance. "All right, who's got a good story?" Daniel asked, rubbing his hands together. "I do," Mia exclaimed. "Have you guys heard about the Raven Mocker?" Jonah shuddered. "Oh, I don't like that one." "Too bad," she teased. "So the Raven Mocker is this evil spirit that steals the hearts of the sick and dying to add years to its own life. It can appear as a raven or take on human form, but only medicine men can see it." "That's creepy," I admitted. Daniel leaned in. "Well, how about this one? It's even scarier. Have you ever heard of the Deer Woman?" Mia rolled her eyes. "Daniel, you know that's just a story to keep kids from wandering off." "Whatever. They say she appears as a beautiful woman to lure people into the woods, but once you're deep enough, she reveals her true form, hooves for feet, and the face of a stag." Jonah looked genuinely frightened. "Can we talk about something else?" I decided to lighten the mood. "How about the legend of the Star People? They're benevolent beings who came from the sky to teach our ancestors wisdom and knowledge." "That's not scary," Daniel objected. "Exactly." I smiled. "Maybe we've had enough spooky stories for now." But Daniel wasn't done. He glanced around and lowered his voice. "You know, Grandpa told me something once, something he said was true." Mia gave him a wary look. "What are you talking about?" He paused for effect. "He said that when he was our age, he encountered a skinwalker. Instantly, the atmosphere changed. We all knew about skinwalkers, witches who could transform into animals using dark magic for evil purposes. It's a subject the elders rarely discuss, and when they do, it's with a sense of dread." "Daniel, I don't think we should talk about that," Mia whispered. "Come on, it's just a story," Jonah said, hugging his knees. "Maybe we should listen to Mia," I added, but now I was curious. "What did Grandpa say?" Daniel took a deep breath. "He said that one night he was out late helping his father gather wood. They got separated somehow. At one point, while searching, he saw a coyote standing on two legs. It was staring at him. At first, Grandpa thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but then it began to walk toward him, its body twisting and contorting. "Stop it," Mia pleaded, but Daniel ignored her and continued. He froze, too scared to move. The coyote had the face of a man stretched over its skull. It whispered his name in a voice that wasn't human. Grandpa ran as fast as he could back home, and when he told his father, they performed a ceremony to protect him. Silence fell over us. Even the forest seemed to have gone quieter, as if it were listening with bated breath to his story. I felt a chill. "Why would you tell that story?" Mia snapped, clearly upset. "It's just a tale," Daniel said, though he looked a bit uneasy himself. Jonah's eyes were wide. "Do you think they're real?" I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but another part remembered the warnings from our elders. "I think we should just go to sleep," I finally said. We agreed and crawled into the tent. It was a tight fit, but we didn't mind. Being close felt safer somehow. At that moment I lay there staring up at the tent's fabric. Shadows from the trees outside started to creep me out. It was hard to go to sleep. Every little sound outside startled me. Hours seemed to pass. I glanced at my watch, 3:15 a.m. Still dark. I was starting to drift off at last when I heard it. A soft shuffling noise, like someone dragging their feet through the underbrush. I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, closer this time. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered. Mia turned over and looked at me. "Hear what?" "Shh," Daniel hissed. "Listen." The shuffling grew louder, accompanied by a faint wheezing like labored breathing. Then Jonah sat up, his eyes wide with terror. "What is that?" he mouthed. Daniel reached for his flashlight, his hands shaking. He gestured for us to stay quiet. Slowly, he unzipped a small part of the tent flap, just enough to peek outside. We crowded around him, each of us trying to see without making any noise. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, illuminating the trees. At first we saw nothing, but then there was movement. Emerging from behind a tree was a figure unlike anything I'd ever seen. It had the body of a coyote, but grotesquely distorted. Its limbs were stretched too long, patches of fur were missing, and skin was pulled tightly over its bones. But the head was the worst part, the most horrifying. It was as if the flesh of a human face had been yanked over a coyote's skull and left there. Its eyes were sunken deep with a faint glow, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. The creature moved in a jerky, unnatural way, circling our camp. Its wheezing breaths echoed in the stillness. It didn't seem aware of us, thankfully, but it was searching for something, its head twitching from side to side. Mia covered her mouth to stifle a scream. Jonah gripped my arm so tight it hurt. Daniel slowly lowered the flap and turned off the flashlight. "What do we do?" I whispered. "Stay quiet," Daniel replied. "Maybe it'll go away." We sat there, huddled closely together, listening as the creature continued to circle us. We waited for the longest time, the wheezing breaths drawing closer and closer, right outside the tent. "Help me," a raspy voice whispered from outside. I felt a surge of terror. It was mimicking human speech, but the voice was distorted and unnatural. "Please, help me," Jonah began to cry softly. Mia held his hand, her own eyes brimming with tears. "Don't respond," Daniel mouthed. The creature pressed against the tent fabric, so close we could see its shadow looming over us. Its smell was overwhelming, decay mixed with something like sulfur. "Why won't you help me?" it whispered, the voice barely more than a breath. I closed my eyes tightly, silently praying for it to leave. The wheezing continued for what felt like ages. Then suddenly, the sounds began to fade. The shuffling moved away, the wheezing grew distant, and eventually the forest returned to its natural symphony of nocturnal creatures. And yet, we didn't move. None of us dared to speak or even breathe too loudly. Dawn was still a couple of hours away, but the thought of stepping outside was terrifying. "Do you think it's gone?" Mia finally whispered. "I don't know," Daniel replied, swallowing hard. "We should wait until sunrise." We sat there, backs against the wall, fighting exhaustion. Sleep was impossible. Every so often we'd hear a distant sound and tense right back up. But the creature didn't return. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we felt a collective relief. The darkness had been our enemy, but daylight brought safety, or at the very least, the illusion of it. "Let's pack up and go," I suggested. Quickly, we stuffed our sleeping bags into our backpacks, not bothering to fold anything properly. Exiting the tent, we looked around slowly and cautiously. The clearing looked innocent enough in the morning light, but the memory of the night's terror lingered. "Should we take the tent down?" Jonah asked. "Leave it," Daniel said. "We can come back for it later." We then made our way back home. The journey back felt way longer than before. When we finally exited the woods and approached the house, we saw our grandparents and parents waiting on the porch for us. Their faces held a mix of anger and worry. "Where have you been?" Grandma demanded, her hands on her hips. Daniel looked down and replied, We went camping." "After we explicitly told you not to?" Grandpa's voice was stern. Mia stepped forward. "We're sorry. We just thought it would be an adventure." Our parents ushered us inside. Once we were seated around the kitchen table, Grandpa looked at each of us intently. "Did anything happen out there?" he asked. We looked at each other, and finally I spoke up. "Yes, sir. We saw something that we can't really explain." Grandma sighed. "We warned you for a reason." "What did you see?" Grandpa pressed, sounding like he already knew what we were going to say. Daniel began to describe the creature we saw in detail. The distorted body, the human-like face, the wheezing, and the voice. Eventually, Grandpa nodded. "It's as I feared." "Was that a skinwalker?" Jonah asked timidly. Grandpa shot him a look so quick that Jonah winced. "Do not speak of it, yes? And I'll say this once, it is what our people call Yi. They are witches who have chosen to embrace darkness, capable of taking the form of animals to harm others." "Why didn't you tell us before?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. "Because speaking of them can draw their attention," Grandma said softly. "We did not want to scare you, but we also hoped you would respect our warnings." Our parents performed a cleansing ceremony that afternoon. Sage smoke filled the house as they chanted prayers for protection. The atmosphere was solemn, but I felt a weight finally lifting off my shoulders. We were grounded for the rest of the stay, which was fine by me. None of us had any desire or plans to venture into those woods again, at least not for a long time. That night, I found myself staring out the window, scared, but also wondering if I would see those eyes again, peering back at me. On my last day, Grandpa sat with me on the porch. "You've learned a hard lesson," he said gently. "I'm sorry we disobeyed," I apologized. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "The spirits of these lands are powerful. Some are good, others are not. So it's important to respect them and the wisdom passed down through generations. Do you think it'll come back?" He gazed out at the tree line. "I believe the ceremony has offered protection. But remember, curiosity can be dangerous. Always trust the guidance of your elders." As I returned to the city, the experience stayed with me. It's something I still think about often, especially at night when the shadows seem a little deeper. I've become more interested in our traditions and stories, realizing they're not just tales, they're lessons. I haven't told too many people about that night. Most don't believe me when I do. But I wanted to share it here. Not to scare you, per se, just to remind you to respect the unknown and to listen to the people that came before us. They figured some things out long before we did, so we wouldn't have to figure them out ourselves. Funny how we naturally don't want to listen. Some things in this world can't easily be explained, and perhaps they shouldn't be. All I know is that I'll never forget those haunting whispers in the dark, and the lessons we learned the hard way. I've always enjoyed camping, but not in crowded campgrounds. The quiet solitude of nature away from people was what I loved. In the summer of 2016, I decided to take a solo trip deep into the Wyoming wilderness. I was 28 at the time, an experienced outdoorsman, and had taken plenty of solo camping trips before, but this one would stick with me forever. I parked my truck near a forest access road about 30 miles outside of Jackson. It wasn't a marked trailhead, just a small dirt pull-off where I could leave my truck hidden. My plan was to hike about 10 miles into the Bridger-Teton National Forest, set up camp, and spend 3 nights in total isolation. I'd packed light but brought everything I needed: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small first aid kit, and a GPS device. The first day went as planned. I hiked through dense forest, over creeks, and up a gradual incline until I reached a small clearing. It was a perfect campsite, flat, surrounded by tall pines for cover, and with a little stream trickling nearby. By the time I pitched my tent and had a small fire going, the sun was setting behind the trees. The forest came alive with the sounds of crickets, frogs, and distant coyotes. I felt completely at peace. The first night was uneventful, just as I'd hoped. I woke up with the sunrise, brewed some coffee on my portable stove, and spent the morning exploring the area. There was no sign of other people, which was exactly what I wanted. I wandered about a mile from camp, checking out some game trails and enjoying the silence. By midday, clouds had rolled in, and the air felt heavy. A storm was coming. I made it back to camp, just as the first drops started to fall. I ducked into my tent and listened as the rain picked up, pattering against the nylon. Thunder rumbled in the distance. It was cozy inside the tent, and I ended up dozing off. When I woke up, it was nearly dark, and the storm had stopped. Everything outside was soaked. I got a small fire going again to cook dinner, but I had an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects were gone. I told myself it was just the aftermath of the storm and tried to ignore it. After eating, I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes about 30 feet away. My heart skipped a beat, but I stayed still, listening. It could have been anything: a deer, a raccoon, even a branch falling. But then it happened again, louder this time. It was deliberate, like something or someone was moving closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything unusual, just trees and wet ground. I told myself it was nothing, and went back to the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to turn in early, hoping sleep would calm my nerves. Inside the tent, I zipped up the flap and secured my gear. My knife and bear spray were within arm's reach, just in case. The night dragged on. Every little sound outside made me jump. Branches creaking, wind rustling leaves, even the occasional drip of water from the trees. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a loud snap. It was close, maybe 20 feet from my tent. My pulse was racing as I grabbed my flashlight and knife. I listened, holding my breath. The snap was followed by a low crunching sound, like something heavy stepping on wet ground. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was pitch black. I couldn't see anything, but the sound continued, moving slowly around the perimeter of my campsite. Whatever it was big, too big to be a deer. My first thought was a bear, but bears don't usually circle like that. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, knife in one hand and flashlight in the other. Eventually, the sound stopped, and the forest went silent again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. I didn't bother making breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The unease from the night before hadn't gone away, and I didn't want to stick around to see what else might happen. As I started hiking, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. About 50 yards from my campsite, the ground was disturbed. Large, deep footprints in the mud. They weren't human, but they weren't exactly animal tracks either. They were too big and too narrow for a bear, with long, almost claw-like impressions at the front. I had no idea what could have made them, and I didn't want to find out. I picked up my pace, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt different now, like it was closing in on me. Every shadow looked like something moving. Every sound made me jump. About halfway back to the truck, I came across something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a tree branch was a small bundle of sticks tied together with string, almost like a crude doll. It hadn't been there on my way in. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was some kind of prank, but who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? I didn't stop to examine it. I just kept moving, practically jogging the rest of the way. When I finally reached the truck, I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors before starting the engine. Relief washed over me as I drove away, but the unease never completely left. To this day, I don't know what I encountered out there. I've told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear acting strangely, but deep down, I know it wasn't. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. Something was out there that night, watching me, following me. Whatever it was, it didn't want me there, and I'll never forget how it felt to be truly alone in the wilderness, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The forest was eerily quiet. The trees, tall and thick with the weight of years, loomed around me as I set up my tent. The sun had long since disappeared behind the horizon, and the temperature had dropped significantly, a chill creeping in with the evening. I wasn't a rookie when it came to camping, having done it often enough to know how to handle the quiet isolation that came with the wilderness. But tonight felt different. I wasn't alone either, though my companion wasn't exactly what you'd call a friend. I'd been camping with Officer Mark Griffin, a cop who'd been working the night shift in a nearby town. Mark had invited me along for some bro time, his words, as a break from the stresses of his job. The idea of being away from the noise of city life appealed to me, and though I wasn't thrilled about his constant police talk, I agreed. Mark wasn't the easiest person to get along with, but he had a commanding presence. He'd been a cop for a decade, and there was something about him that made people nervous, even without the uniform. He was in his mid-30s, stocky, broad-shouldered, and often had a look of permanent suspicion on his face. His eyes were sharp, and he kept a hand on his gun like it was an extension of his body. Still, he wasn't someone I felt scared of. Rather, I just felt like there was always a distance between us. I unpacked my bag, laying out the tent and my sleeping bag. Mark was off to the side, busy with his own setup, muttering something to himself as he worked. His flashlight cast shadows across his face, and I could see the weariness in his eyes. He hadn't been getting much sleep lately, complaining about the demands of his job. As the last of the daylight disappeared, the moon cast a pale glow across the clearing. The trees around us swayed gently in the wind, the only sound in the quiet woods. It should have been peaceful, but something about the stillness felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but every now and then I caught myself scanning the woods, feeling like I was being watched. After a few hours of sitting around the campfire, talking about nothing in particular, Mark stood up abruptly. He adjusted his jacket, the movement sharp and deliberate. "I'm going to take a walk. You good here?" he asked, his voice low, like he was trying to convince himself more than me. "Yeah, I'm good." I wasn't sure where he was headed, but I figured it was just some cop thing. He did that sometimes, wandering off alone into the woods like he was looking for something. Maybe he just liked the solitude. Mark's boots crunched on the dry leaves as he disappeared into the trees, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. I didn't think much of it until I noticed how long he'd been gone. The hours passed, and the silence of the forest became overwhelming. The crackling of the fire seemed too loud now, and the wind had died down completely. I glanced at my watch. Almost an hour had passed since Mark left. I wasn't exactly worried, but I started to wonder where he could have gone. We had a pretty basic setup, and there was no reason for him to be out this far. I considered getting up to look for him, but I didn't want to seem overly concerned. I reminded myself that he was a cop. He could handle himself. I went to the edge of the camp, where the shadows from the trees stretched long and dark. The forest looked endless, each part of it shrouded in mystery. I could see nothing but the occasional flicker of movement, leaves shifting or an animal scurrying. Another half hour passed. I was about to go inside my tent and call it a night when I heard it, a sound from deeper in the woods. It wasn't a normal animal noise, no rustling or snapping of branches. This was something more deliberate, the sound of boots crunching through leaves, slow and measured, like someone was walking toward me. I held my breath, my hand gripping the flashlight at my side. For a moment, I thought it might be Mark returning, but something didn't feel right. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate, and the way the sound paused, as if the person had stopped, gave me chills. "Mark?" I called out. No answer. I felt my heart rate pick up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. That sound again. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I wasn't sure if I should go after him or wait. I decided to go with caution. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the noise, the beam cutting through the darkness. The forest closed in around me as I moved deeper, each step feeling like I was walking into a trap. The trees felt like they were closing in, and the chill in the air made it hard to breathe. I called Mark's name again, louder this time, but still got no response. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw something. A shadow darting between the trees, too quick to be an animal. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My hand gripped the flashlight tighter, the beam shaking as I pointed it in the direction of the movement. I moved cautiously, my feet crunching underfoot in the quiet. The shadow was moving again, always just out of sight. I felt like something was wrong, like I was walking straight into a trap, and every instinct in me screamed to turn around. I heard something else now, a low whisper in the wind. But it wasn't the wind at all. It was someone else, someone close. I turned a corner, and then I saw it. Mark's flashlight was lying on the ground, still on, its light flickering weakly. His gun, holstered and abandoned, lay beside it. My stomach dropped. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw him. Mark was lying motionless against a tree, his eyes wide open, staring unblinking into the void. Blood was pooled around him, soaking into the leaves. His chest was a mess of torn clothing, a jagged wound in his side. He had been stabbed. Badly. I felt my stomach churn. Every part of me wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, staring at his lifeless body. I couldn't understand. Who would do this? Why would anyone want to hurt a cop out here? The air grew colder, and I realized I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel eyes on me from the dark, feel the presence of someone or something lurking just out of sight. I needed to get out of there, but my body wouldn't move. My legs wouldn't work, and all I could do was stare at the horror in front of me. Something cracked behind me. I spun around, the flashlight flicking wildly across the trees. Nothing, just shadows. But then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I backed away, heart pounding. The ground seemed to shift beneath me as I stumbled backward, my flashlight now useless in the black void. I had to get away, but how? The woods felt endless, and Mark's body lay behind me, a reminder of the danger. I ran. My feet hit the ground hard, each step more frantic than the last. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. The footsteps followed, getting closer. Too close. They weren't even trying to be quiet anymore, and I knew that whoever, or whatever, was chasing me wasn't interested in playing games. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the clearing, where the campfire still burned weakly. My breath came in sharp gasps, and I collapsed beside my tent, my mind spinning. There was no sound anymore, no movement. But the feeling of being watched lingered, like something was out there, just waiting. The whole forest felt like it was holding its breath. I was alone. Black-Eyed Kids in the Woods. From Big Red. I've been debating whether or not to share this, but it's been weighing on my mind, and maybe putting it out there will help me process what happened. This isn't some spooky campfire tale. It's something that actually occurred just a few months ago. I'm from Columbus, Ohio. My two best friends are Tyler and Greg. We've been tight since high school, played football together, went to the same college, the whole deal. Back in April, Greg's dad passed away suddenly. It was a heart attack that came out of nowhere. No warning, nothing. Greg was devastated. His dad was his rock, and losing him hit Greg harder than anything I'd ever seen. After the funeral, he was in a dark place. Tyler and I tried everything to help him out, but nothing seemed to lift his spirits. One evening, out of the blue, Greg called us up. He suggested we all go on a camping trip like we used to. He said he needed to get out of the city and clear his head. Tyler and I were all for it. Some time in nature might be just what he needed. We decided to head to Wayne National Forest in southeastern Ohio. It's a massive area with dense woods and not too many people. a perfect spot to get away. Tyler had recently bought a small RV camper. It wasn't luxurious, but it had the basics. A couple of bunks, a tiny kitchen area, and, best of all, a heater for those chilly nights. We packed up on a Friday afternoon, sleeping bags, hiking gear, a cooler full of food and drinks, then hit the road. The drive was filled with our usual joking around, though Greg was quieter than usual. We didn't push him, we just let him be. When we got to the forest, we decided to find a spot off the main trails. We wanted seclusion, a place where we could relax without other campers nearby. After navigating some narrow dirt roads, we found a clearing surrounded by tall pines. It felt right, so we set up camp, started a fire, and spent the evening grilling burgers and reminiscing. The sky was clear, and the stars were out in full force. Tyler, who's always been into astronomy, was thrilled. "Look at that sky," he said, lying back on a log. "You don't get views like this in the city." "Yeah, it's pretty amazing," I agreed. Greg seemed to relax a bit, sipping his beer and even cracking a smile now and then. It was good to see him loosen up. Around midnight, Tyler had an idea. "I'm going to sleep on the roof of the camper tonight," he announced. "I don't want to miss any of this." Greg chuckled. "You're nuts, man." "Maybe," Tyler grinned, "but I'll have the best view." I laughed. "Just don't roll off in your sleep." He grabbed a sleeping bag and climbed up, settling in on the flat roof. Greg and I decided to turn in and headed inside the camper. It was cozy, 2 small bunks and just enough room to stand up. I climbed into my bunk and pulled out my phone, scrolling through social media. Greg was lying across from me, staring at the ceiling. "You doing okay?" I asked. He sighed. "Yeah, just thinking." "About your dad?" "Yeah, he would have loved this," I nodded. "He was a good man." "Thanks," Greg said softly. We fell into silence, and eventually I started to drift off. Sometime later, I woke up to a soft knocking sound. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then it came again, a gentle tap at the camper door. "Greg? Greg, you hear that?" I whispered. He stirred. "Hear what?" "Someone's knocking." We both listened. There it was again, a faint, deliberate knock. "Maybe it's Tyler messing with us," Greg suggested. Just then my phone buzzed. It was a text from Tyler. "Are you guys awake?" it read. "Yes," I replied. "Are you knocking on the door?" "Nope, but I see someone outside." My heart skipped a beat. "Who?" "Looks like 2 kids standing near the fire pit." I showed the text to Greg. He looked as puzzled as I felt. "What are kids doing out here at this hour?" he asked. "No idea," I said. "Should we check it out?" He nodded. "Well, we can't just ignore them." I called out through the door. Hello? Can we help you?" A small voice replied, "Please, we need to use your phone." Something about the voice felt off to me. It was flat, almost mechanical. Where are your parents?" Greg asked. "Please, let us in," the voice said again. I felt a creeping sensation in my gut. We can call someone for you," I offered. "Just tell us the number." Silence. Then, "We need to come in. Let us in." My phone buzzed again. Tyler had sent another message. "Don't let them in. Something isn't right." "What's going on?" I typed back. "Their eyes, they look completely black." I felt a chill run down my spine and showed the message to Greg. "What does that even mean?" he whispered. "I don't know, but Tyler seems serious." The knocking grew louder. "Let us in," the voices demanded. They sounded more forceful than before. "Look, we can get you some help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, you need to invite us in," the voice insisted. "Why do you need an invitation?" Greg asked. "Please, we just want to come in," the voice said, almost pleading now. My phone buzzed again. Tyler wrote, "They're acting weird. They keep looking up here, but I don't think they can see me." "Should we call the police?" I texted back. "Maybe, but we're pretty far out," he replied. Greg was starting to look uneasy. "What do we do?" "I think we should just keep the door locked," I said firmly. The knocking stopped for a moment. Everything went silent. Then we heard footsteps circling the camper, slow and deliberate. "They're walking around," Greg whispered. We stayed quiet, listening to the soft crunching of leaves underfoot. The footsteps stopped near one of the windows. "Please let us in," the voice said again right outside. I peered through the curtain but couldn't see much, just a small figure standing close to the window. "Why won't you let us in?" the voice asked, sounding desperate. I didn't know what to reply. My mind was reeling. Then, from above, we heard a soft thump. Tyler texted, "Oh my god, they're trying to climb up here." "Be careful," I typed back. He responded, "One of them said something weird. I swear it sounded like your friends won't help you." I showed the message to Greg. "This is getting creepy," he said. "Agreed," I replied. "Maybe we need to regroup." "Good idea." We decided to bring Tyler inside. I mustered up some courage and opened the door just enough to stick my head out. "Tyler," I whispered loudly, "get down here." He carefully climbed down the ladder on the side of the camper. As he reached the ground, we heard one of the voices. "Now you've made a mistake." We quickly got inside and locked the door behind us. "What the heck is going on?" Greg asked. "I don't know," Tyler said, catching his breath. "But those kids, their eyes are pitch black. No whites, no iris, nothing." "That's impossible," I said. "Well, I saw it," he insisted. We sat there, the three of us, trying to make sense of the situation. "Maybe they're wearing contacts," Greg suggested. "At this hour? In the middle of nowhere?" Tyler replied. "Just for some prank?" My phone buzzed again. An unknown number. The message read, "You cannot hide from us." I showed it to the others. "Did you guys give your numbers out?" They shook their heads. "How did they get your number?" Greg asked. "I have no idea." The footsteps started again, this time more rapidly, circling the camper. "This is messed up," Tyler said. "We should call the police, right?" Greg asked. I tried to dial 911, but somehow the call wouldn't connect. It didn't make sense, no signal, I guess. I stared at my phone. "Same here," Tyler said, checking his. "Great," Greg muttered. The voices came again, sounding more irritated this time. "This is your last chance. Let us in." "Ignore them," I whispered. We huddled together, hoping they would just go away. Minutes felt like hours as we sat there in silence. Then everything went quiet. The footsteps, the voices. They were gone. "Do you think they left?" Greg wondered. "Maybe," Tyler said skeptically. I peered out the window, but didn't see anybody. "Let's just wait a bit to be sure," I suggested. We stayed put for another half hour, and when there were no further sounds, we started to relax slightly. "Maybe it was just some kind of prank," Greg said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Who would go to that length?" Tyler asked. "Kids from town? I don't know." "Well, I'm not staying to find out," I said. "Let's pack it up and get out of here." We quickly gathered our things, trying to make as little noise as possible. As we stepped outside, the forest was eerily still. The fire had died down to glowing embers. We loaded up the camper, and just as we were about to get in, I heard it. "Do you think you're leaving?" One of those voices called out from somewhere in the dark. I spun around, but I didn't see anyone. "Who's out here?" I shouted, my voice betraying my nerves. "Silence! Let's go!" Tyler urged. We jumped into the camper, and Greg started the engine. As we pulled away, the headlights briefly illuminated two figures standing at the edge of the clearing. They looked like kids, but their faces were obscured by shadows. "Did you see that?" Greg gasped, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Just drive," I said. We didn't stop until we reached a gas station about 30 miles away. It was brightly lit and felt like a sanctuary compared to the darkness we had just left. Inside, we grabbed coffees and sat down at a booth. "What the heck just happened to us, guys?" Greg asked, his hands shaking. "No idea," Tyler replied. "But those kids, whatever they actually were not normal." I pulled out my phone and did some searching for anything that might explain it. I stumbled upon loads of stories about black-eyed children, accounts eerily similar to ours. "Guys, look at this," I said, showing them my phone. We read through several stories together. Stories of people encountering children with completely black eyes, children who insisted on being let inside homes or vehicles. "This can't be a real thing," Greg said. "I know what you're feeling, but..." "We just experienced this," Tyler said. We sat there for a while, processing everything. Eventually, we decided to head back home. Over the next few days, we kept in close contact, sharing any strange occurrences. Fortunately, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Greg started attending grief counseling and seemed to be coping better. "Sounds crazy," he told me one day, "but maybe facing something unexplainable made me realize I can't control everything." "I'm glad you're doing better," I told him. "Me too. But let's avoid any more camping trips for a while." "Agreed." I laughed. Life started to return to normal. I haven't received any more strange texts, and neither have Greg or Tyler. I'm praying this was a one-time thing. Maybe we'll never fully understand what happened that night. But if you ever find yourself alone somewhere, and someone knocks at the door begging to be let in, be doubly sure about what you do next. Stay safe out there. It was early October, and the woods outside of Denver, Colorado, were beginning to show the first signs of autumn. The air had that crisp, cool edge to it, and the leaves were turning yellow and orange, creating a colorful quilt on the ground. I had decided to take a weekend trip into the woods just to get away from everything. No cell service, no distractions, just me and the open trail. I had done this 100 times before, always on my own. There was something about the solitude of camping that felt comforting to me. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon after a long drive down winding dirt roads. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees as I set up my tent. The area was remote, with only a few scattered campsites nearby, but it wasn't crowded at all. I liked that. It was just the way I preferred it, quiet and isolated. By the time my tent was up, the sun had almost set. I decided to light a small campfire, knowing it would get chilly once the night fell. As I sat by the fire, poking at the embers, the sound of the woods settled in around me, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves as a breeze picked up, and the soft crackle of the fire. It was peaceful, like a lullaby from nature itself. I had planned to cook some dinner, but I wasn't very hungry. Instead, I just sat there watching the flames dance, letting my mind wander. There was no particular reason I'd chosen this spot other than that it felt right. But as the night wore on, I started to feel a bit uneasy. It was subtle at first, a flicker of discomfort that I couldn't place. Maybe it was just being alone in the wilderness, but something felt off. As I sat there, the night deepened, and the forest seemed to grow quieter, more still. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard something. It wasn't an animal. I had spent enough time in the woods to know the sounds of wildlife. But this was different. It was the faintest shuffle, almost like footsteps in the leaves. At first, I dismissed it as a deer or some other animal, but the sound kept coming, growing steadily closer. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease that crept up my spine. I looked around the campsite, but everything seemed normal. The fire flickered, and the shadows in the trees seemed still. But the footsteps continued, soft and measured, as if whoever or whatever was out there was moving carefully. I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My breath came a little faster now, but I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was another camper or a ranger. It wasn't uncommon for people to hike through these woods, and I could have easily missed a group setting up their own campsite nearby. Still, something about the footsteps unsettled me. The rhythm was off. It wasn't the uneven, stumbling gait of an animal. It was deliberate, too controlled, and it was too quiet. If it were an animal, I would have heard twigs snap or leaves rustle louder. The footsteps stopped. I waited for a long moment, listening intently, but the woods were silent again. My heart was pounding now, and I debated calling out, but something stopped me. I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. Instead, I reached for the flashlight I had left beside me. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the campsite. But there was nothing, just the trees, the fire, and the shadows stretching long across the ground. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing down on me. But just as I began to relax, thinking I had imagined it, the footsteps started again. This time, they were closer. I whipped around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but I still saw nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled and my pulse quickened. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was close. I could almost feel their presence, like a weight pressing against my chest. My mind raced, but my body wouldn't move. I tried to tell myself it was just the wilderness playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I was no longer alone. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, barely visible in the darkness between the trees, stood still, watching me. The shape was vague at first, but as I focused, I could make out a man. He was tall, but he blended into the night so well that it was hard to see any details beyond his outline. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I didn't know who he was, but I knew instinctively that something wasn't right. He wasn't a hiker, a camper, or a ranger. He didn't belong here. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The man didn't move, but he didn't leave either. It was like he was waiting for something. Waiting for me, maybe. I had no idea how long he had been standing there, but it felt like hours, and my mind was spinning. Was he a threat? Had I stumbled into someone else's territory? After what seemed like an eternity, I finally gathered the courage to speak, my voice barely a whisper. Hello? I tried, but the word came out shaky and weak. The man didn't respond. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for him to make the next move. But he didn't. He just stood there, motionless, like some sort of ghostly figure. The silence stretched out even longer, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to pack up and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the man stepped back into the shadows. The footsteps I had been hearing stopped completely. The forest returned to its eerie silence. But this time, I knew something was wrong. I didn't wait around. I grabbed my gear, stuffed it into my backpack as quickly as I could, and rushed to my truck. The light from the flashlight trembled in my hand as I stumbled toward the vehicle, half expecting to see the man following me in the darkness. But when I reached my truck, there was no sign of him. I didn't stick around to see if he would show up again. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness, and I didn't stop until I was back in town, safe and sound. The air in the truck was thick with fear, and my heart was still pounding as I drove, every sense on high alert. I never went camping alone in those woods again. I still don't know who that man was or what his intentions were. I never saw him again, but I can't shake the feeling that he was out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, when I drive through the area, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, a movement. But I never stop to look. I never want to find out if he's still there. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut pine. I'd been up in these woods for over 2 weeks now, alone with nothing but my chainsaw, an old pickup truck, and the dense forest surrounding my temporary campsite. The year was 2023, and the job was simple. Cut down a few trees, haul the logs back, and turn them into rough-cut furniture. It was the kind of work that felt honest, hard, and calming, if you could ignore the isolation. I was 31 years old, and after years of bouncing between dead-end jobs in the city, I decided to try something different. I had no family to miss me, no real friends, so when a furniture maker offered me this solitary job up in the mountains of North Carolina, I jumped at the chance. The first few days had been peaceful. I spent my days cutting wood and my nights around a small fire, trying to make sense of my life. The solitude was the perfect escape, until the nights started to feel different. That evening, I finished my work early and decided to do a little extra chopping before heading back to camp. The forest was quiet, save for the steady hum of the chainsaw cutting through the thick trunks of trees. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ground. As the last rays of light disappeared, I put down the saw and looked around. The woods were suddenly much darker than they had been just moments ago. I hadn't realized how far I'd wandered from my campsite. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, thick with underbrush and the low hum of insects. I wasn't worried, though. This was my territory now. I knew the way back, or at least I thought I did. But the air felt heavier, thicker somehow, like the weight of the trees themselves was pressing down on me. I heard something then, twigs snapping in the distance. It was faint at first, just a soft crackling. I paused and listened, trying to gauge the direction. The noise was irregular, not like a deer or any other animal I knew of around here. It was too deliberate, too methodical. My hand instinctively went to the handle of the knife I kept on my belt, though I knew it wouldn't do much against whatever was out there. My flashlight, which I always kept with me, was lying in the truck, not helpful now. The crackling stopped. For a moment, everything was still. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear, or something smaller, maybe even a fox. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I shook my head and turned to head back to camp, but my foot caught on a thick root, sending me sprawling forward. My hands hit the ground, the dirt and pine needles scraping my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a second, I froze. That's when I heard it again. A low grunt, like something large and heavy moving through the forest. The sound was closer now, way too close for comfort. I felt a surge of adrenaline and scrambled to my feet, trying to listen through the pounding of my heart. The forest around me felt alive, but not in a good way. My mind was racing. Could it be another person? Maybe another camper or a lost hiker? But something about the sound felt wrong. No person would be moving through the woods like that. No person I knew, anyway. I started moving faster, retracing my steps, but the deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. I turned, thinking I saw something in the distance, a shadow flitting between the trees. But when I focused, nothing was there. The night was thick with uncertainty, and I was beginning to feel small, like a prey animal being stalked by something much larger. I reached the edge of a small clearing. There, in the middle of it, I saw a figure standing completely still. It wasn't very tall, but broad and thick, crouched down low, maybe even crawling before it stood up straight. I could barely make out any features in the dark, but it wasn't human. The shape was wrong. Its proportions were off. Long arms and a slouch that made it seem unnaturally low to the ground. I was frozen. I couldn't think. My body was screaming at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my legs were glued to the earth. Then, just like that, the figure took a step forward. I snapped out of my paralysis and bolted. Every branch I passed seemed to catch my clothes or snag my arms, but I didn't dare stop. My lungs burned as I pushed through the trees, my feet pounding the earth. I knew I had to make it back to the truck. It was my only shot. The thumping of something large running behind me was faint but unmistakable. I could hear it, feel it. Whatever it was following me. I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached the clearing where my truck was parked, I was out of breath and shaking. I scrambled for my keys, fumbling as I tried to unlock the door. Every movement felt slow, too slow, like I was in some kind of nightmare. When I finally got the door open, I jumped in and slammed it shut behind me. I didn't take a second to breathe. I cranked the engine, threw the truck into gear, and sped down the rough dirt path, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't even care if I was going the right way. I just had to get out. The headlights cut through the night, illuminating the trees ahead. But every now and then I thought I saw something just off the road. A figure standing still in the shadows, watching me. I didn't stop, not for anything. I drove for what felt like hours, not slowing down until I finally reached the small town at the base of the mountain. It wasn't until I parked in a gas station lot that I finally took a moment to breathe, my hands still shaking as I turned off the engine. I sat there for a long time, staring at the dim lights of the station. The noise of the world felt like a distant echo compared to the stillness of the woods. I wanted to believe it was just some wild animal, maybe a bear or a boar, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It had been something else. I wasn't sure I'd be able to return to that spot again. The forest felt like a different place now, one where something was out there, watching me, waiting for the right moment. Maybe I was just spooked. Maybe it was the isolation, the constant hum of the chainsaw, the way the forest closed in around me at night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in those woods wasn't done with me yet. It felt like I was always being watched. The beast is still here. From Alice K last summer, my friend Lily and I decided to take a little trip to France. We'd both just graduated from college and wanted to do something a bit more adventurous before diving into the whole career thing. We'd saved up some cash from our part-time jobs and planned a 2-week backpacking trip through the French countryside. We started in Paris, of course, soaking in all the touristy stuff, the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, the drill. But both of us were more interested in the less traveled paths, so we headed south to the rural areas, wanting to experience what we called the real France. One place that caught our attention was the region of Jodon. Lily had read about it in some historical thriller novel and was intrigued by the legends of the Beast of Jodon, a creature that supposedly terrorized the area in the 18th century. I'm a bit of a history buff myself, so I was all in. We arrived in a small village called Maruis, nestled in the mountains. It was picturesque, with cobblestone streets and old stone houses. The locals were friendly enough, but seemed a bit reserved when we mentioned our interest in the beast's legend. One elderly woman even crossed herself and muttered something under her breath when we brought it up. Undeterred, we found a quiet little inn to stay in and planned a hike through the nearby forests the next day. The innkeeper, a middle-aged man I'll call Jax, warned us to stick to the marked trails. "People can get lost easily," he said in his thick accent. "And wolves have been more active lately." "Wolves?" Lily asked, her eyes lighting up. "Yes, but they usually avoid humans," he replied. "Just be cautious." The next morning, our backpacks loaded with snacks and all the goods, we set off. The forest was breathtaking, tall trees forming a canopy overhead, and the smell of pine in the air. The birds chirping were a nice cherry on top. It was everything we'd hoped for, the very reason we planned this trip in the first place. About 2 hours into the hike, we came across an old overgrown path that wasn't on our map. Lily, ever the adventurous type, thought that we should take it. "Come on, Emma," she said, tugging at my arm. "This is exactly the kind of off-the-beaten-path experience we both want." I hesitated. "I don't know. Jack said to stay on the marked trails." She rolled her eyes playfully. "Are you afraid of the beast from a few hundred years ago? Think it's going to come back and get us?" I laughed. "Fine, but if we get lost, I'm blaming you." We ventured down the path, which wound deeper into the woods. The trees were denser here, and the light filtering through the leaves gave everything a greenish hue. It was eerie but beautiful. After about an hour, we stumbled upon a clearing with the ruins of what looked like an old stone cottage. Moss covered the walls, and nature had begun to reclaim the place. Intrigued, we decided to explore. "Imagine who might have lived here," Lily mused, running her hand over the rough stone as we looked around. I noticed strange markings etched into one of the remaining walls. They did not look like any writing I'd seen, more like symbols or sigils. "Hey, check this out," I called to Lily. She walked over, squinting at the markings. "Weird. Maybe it's some kind of old language." That moment, a strange rustling sound came from the trees behind us. We both froze. Eventually, I whispered, "Maybe just an animal." "Maybe," Lily suggested, her earlier bravado now fading. "Yeah, good idea." As we turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees, a large dark shape that seemed to be too big to be a deer. "Did you see that?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. "See what?" "I don't know. I saw something move over there." We stood still, together scanning the forest. The woods had gone unnervingly quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. "Come on, let's go," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. We started back the way we came, walking quickly but trying not to panic. Every so often, I'd hear the crack of a twig or the rustle of leaves, and I would glance back to see nothing. After what felt like ages, we realized we weren't on the same path that we'd taken earlier. "Are we lost?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "The path should be right here," Lily insisted, looking around frantically. We pulled out the map, but it was useless. We had no idea where we were, and better yet, our phones had no signal, and the GPS wasn't working well under the thick canopy. "Okay, let's stay calm," I said. "We can retrace our steps." Just then, a low growl came through the trees. This time, we both heard it. I remember Lily joking, asking if that was my stomach, but she sounded terrified. We started to move faster, the growling growing louder and closer. Suddenly, Lily screamed, and I spun around to see this massive animal emerge from the shadows. It looked like a wolf, but far too large, with matted fur and glowing yellow eyes. Its snout was longer than a wolf's too, and saliva dripped from its bared fangs. "Run!" I shouted. We sprinted through the trees, branches whipping against our faces. I could hear it behind us, crashing through the underbrush. My lungs burned, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Out of nowhere, Lily tripped over a root and went sprawling. I skidded to a halt and rushed back to help her up. "Come on," I urged, pulling her to her feet. "That thing is closing in on us." In blind panic, we veered off to the left, spotting a rocky incline ahead. We scrambled up the rocks, hoping the creature couldn't follow us. Reaching the top, we found ourselves on another trail, a real one this time, with signs and markers. Relief washed over me. "Look!" I pointed to a sign indicating the way back to the village. But before we could celebrate, the beast appeared at the bottom of the incline, staring up at us with those malevolent eyes. It let out a howl that echoed through the mountains. "Go!" Lily yelled. We raced down the trail, the creature now out of sight, but the fear propelling us forward. After running non-stop for what felt like miles, we burst out of the forest and fell onto a road where a small van was parked. An older man was loading crates into the back. He looked up, startled to see two disheveled girls sprinting toward him. "Please help us," I gasped. He took one look at us and gestured for us to get into the van. Without hesitation, we jumped in and he sped off toward the village. "What happened?" he asked in broken English. Some kind of animal chased us," Lily explained between breaths. He nodded grimly. "The beast." "You know about it?" I asked. He didn't answer me, but that alone was answer enough. Back in Maruis, we went straight to the inn. Jack took one look at us and shook his head. "You went off the trails, didn't you?" he said, not unkindly. "We're sorry," I apologized, "but we saw something out there. Something that shouldn't exist." Jack sighed. "Zond is not just a story. Many here have seen it." "Why doesn't anyone do something about it?" Lily demanded. He shrugged. "What can we do? It's a curse that has plagued this region for centuries." That night we stayed in our room, doors locked and windows shuttered. Neither of us slept much. The next morning, we decided to cut our trip short and head back to Paris. As we were leaving, Jack handed us a small pendant with an intricate design. "What's this?" I asked. "A protective charm for your safety." We thanked him and left, eager to put distance between us and whatever lurked in those woods. Back in Paris, amidst the bustle of the city, the whole experience felt surreal. But the nightmares that followed reminded me that it was, in fact, real. I still have dreams on occasion of those yellow eyes and that haunting growl. Lily and I don't talk about it much. When people do ask about our trip, we stick to the highlights: the Eiffel Tower, the cafes, the art museums. No one would believe our encounter anyway. But I do wonder now, what else is out there in the hidden corners of the world? What other things exist that people simply are too afraid to talk about? And I still can't shake the feeling that we were lucky enough to make it out of Jodan alive. I've always enjoyed the quiet solitude of camping. There's something calming about being in the middle of nowhere. Just you, the forest, and the hum of nature. My last trip was no different. It was late September, the weather cool but not too chilly, the leaves still holding on to their autumn colors. I had picked a secluded spot deep in the woods, miles from the nearest trail, far from any busy campsites. The kind of place you go to get away from it all. I was by myself, as usual. I'd been camping alone for years, ever since I was in my early 20s. It was a way for me to recharge, to clear my head. I found a small, flat area surrounded by trees and set up my tent. The site was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and the chirping of birds in the distance. That evening, after a simple dinner of canned chili and crackers, I settled in by the campfire. I brought a book, but I didn't feel like reading. Instead, I just stared into the flames, lost in thought. It was peaceful out here, but as the night wore on, something felt off. It was hard to describe, like the air itself had grown heavier. Or maybe it was just the quiet. There wasn't even the usual hum of insects or the occasional sound of an animal moving through the underbrush. It was too still. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the fire started to die down, I felt an odd urge to get up and walk around. There was no reason for it, really. I just had this need to move. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped on my boots, and stepped out of the warmth of the firelight into the cold, dark woods. I stayed within sight of my campsite at first, the beam of my flashlight sweeping over the ground and the trees. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But as I walked a little farther, my light caught something strange on the ground. It was partially hidden in the leaves and dirt, just barely visible. I crouched down to get a closer look. It was a skull. Human. My heart raced as I stared at it, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. I wasn't prepared for this. I had heard of people stumbling upon animal bones in the woods, maybe even old abandoned campsites, but a human skull? That was something entirely different. It wasn't just any skull either. It was old. Way old. Older than I had anticipated. There were no signs of a body nearby, no trace of a burial. The skull was weathered, worn by time, the bones bleached almost white by the sun. I turned it over in my hands carefully. The jaw was partially cracked, and the teeth inside were missing or broken. It looked like it had been there for a long time. I took a step back, suddenly uneasy. I had no idea how to explain this. Was it a recent find? Or had it been here for years, left untouched by time? The thought of someone dying out here in the woods alone made my stomach churn. It wasn't a comforting thought. I shone my flashlight around the area, hoping for some clue about what had happened, but there was nothing. Just trees, leaves, and the dark quiet of the forest. I decided to take the skull back to camp with me. It was morbid, but I couldn't leave it there. Something about it called to me, like a mystery that needed solving. I gently placed it in my backpack and made my way back to the fire. Once I got back, I set the skull down on the log next to my campfire, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do with it? I sat there for a while, the fire crackling in the background, the skull's empty eyes staring back at me. It was strange, almost unsettling. The kind of thing you couldn't unsee once you had. And I knew I wouldn't be able to just ignore it. As the hours passed, I found myself more and more drawn to it. I couldn't explain why. I thought about packing up and leaving, heading back to civilization, but the thought of the long drive in the dark kept me rooted to the spot. Instead, I continued to stare into the fire, the skull looming beside me. Eventually, I fell asleep in my tent, the skull still beside the fire. I wasn't sure if I had dreamed it or if it was real, but I could have sworn I heard something moving around my campsite during the night. A rustling in the leaves, something shifting in the shadows. But when I checked in the morning, everything was just as it had been the night before. The next morning, I packed up my things, still uneasy but determined to get the rest of the trip over with. I had a few more days off, but I couldn't bring myself to stay another night. I buried the skull under a pile of rocks and leaves, not sure if that was what I was supposed to do with it, but it felt like the right thing. As I left the campsite behind and drove back into town, the weight of the whole experience stuck with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something out there in the woods, something old and forgotten. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was the skull itself. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be camping there again. I had never been one for camping, but my buddy Alex convinced me that this weekend would be different. It was the fall of 2018, and we had planned to head out to a secluded spot in the woods about 3 hours from the nearest town. The area was known for being quiet and peaceful, a perfect place to unwind, or so we thought. We arrived at the site on a Friday evening, just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. Alex had done all the planning, from the food to the gear, so all I had to do was follow his lead. I wasn't the most outdoorsy person, but I trusted Alex. He'd been camping all his life and seemed to know everything about the wilderness. We set up our tents in a small clearing near a creek that ran through the woods. The air was cool but not uncomfortable, and the smell of damp earth and pine trees filled my nose. Alex started a fire while I unpacked our bags. There were no other campers in sight, which I thought was odd considering the place was a popular destination for weekend getaways. But I figured it didn't matter. We'd have the whole place to ourselves. As night fell, we sat by the fire eating canned beans and chatting about life. The sound of the creek flowing nearby was soothing, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees gave the woods a sense of life. But as the evening wore on, something began to feel off. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what it was. It wasn't any one thing. It was the quiet. The kind of quiet that settled over everything like a thick blanket. I noticed that there were no crickets chirping, no owls hooting, not even the usual sounds of small animals rustling in the underbrush. Just stillness. "Hey, you hear that?" I asked Alex, breaking the silence. He paused, listening intently. "No, but now that you mention it, it's dead quiet. Probably just the time of year." I shrugged, trying to brush off the unease I felt. We finished our meal, and I set about preparing for bed. The fire was beginning to burn out, leaving only a few embers glowing faintly in the dark. Alex was already in his tent, and I was about to crawl into mine when I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. My heart started to race. It was too loud to be an animal. It sounded like someone was walking through the woods, deliberately trying to make noise. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shone it out into the dark. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but the thick black shadows between the trunks. I waited, straining my ears for any other sound. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no more snapping branches, just the same silence as before. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal or maybe a tree branch falling. But the feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. I looked over at Alex's tent. His silhouette was barely visible in the dim light, and there was no movement from inside. I considered waking him, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. After a long, uncomfortable pause, I finally crawled into my own tent, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind stir the trees, my mind running wild. Was someone out there? Or was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? It didn't help that I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I pulled the sleeping bag over my head and tried to sleep, but the feeling only grew stronger. The night stretched on, and I kept hearing noises. Soft footsteps on the leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, like someone was moving closer. Each time I shone my flashlight out, I saw nothing. At around 3 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. It was faint but unmistakable, like someone whispering just outside my tent. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely a voice, not the usual sounds of the forest. I held my breath, trying to listen more closely, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. I lay completely still, not daring to move. The only sound I could hear now was the rush of the creek, far in the distance. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke to the sounds of birds chirping. The sky was clear, and the sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over the campsite. Alex was already up, sitting by the fire and sipping from a mug. "You sleep all right?" he asked when he saw me emerge from the tent. I didn't want to seem too freaked out, so I just nodded. "Yeah, just had a weird night, I guess." Alex didn't seem to notice anything off. He was his usual laid-back self, setting up breakfast as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced around the campsite, my eyes scanning the surrounding trees and the thick underbrush that stretched out beyond our small clearing. It was too quiet. The silence from last night was still hanging in the air. We spent the morning hiking a nearby trail, but I couldn't enjoy it like I normally would. Every crack of a branch, every rustling of leaves made my heart race. I kept expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just out of sight. The trail was supposed to be a relaxing walk, but I was on edge the entire time. That afternoon, we decided to head back to camp and rest. I was hoping a nap would help settle my nerves, but when we returned, things only got worse. I don't know what tipped me off first. Maybe it was the way Alex's tent was slightly out of place, or how the fire pit had been disturbed, the logs scattered in a way that didn't make sense. Or maybe it was the fact that the creek, which had been rushing steadily the night before, was now eerily quiet. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't. Something was wrong. We spent the rest of the day at camp, but I was constantly looking over my shoulder, my eyes darting to every movement in the trees. When night fell, the silence returned even heavier than before. We had a campfire again, but the warmth of the flames didn't ease my nerves this time. Around midnight, when the fire had burned low, I heard the sounds again. Snap! 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 Someone or something was out there, moving in the woods. I wasn't sure if Alex had heard it too, but I couldn't take it anymore. I told him I was going to check the perimeter. He didn't argue, he just sat there by the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering light. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out into the woods, moving cautiously, listening for any other signs of movement. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I certainly wasn't prepared for what I found. A few yards away from the campsite, I found fresh footprints. Big, heavy footprints. And they weren't animal tracks. They were human. Barefoot, but unmistakably human. I could feel my breath catching in my throat. Who else would be out here? There was no one else at the campground when we arrived, and we hadn't seen a soul since. I followed the tracks for a while, my heart pounding in my chest. But then I stopped, realizing something that made my blood run cold. The tracks led nowhere. They stopped suddenly, as if the person had simply vanished. I turned around quickly, my stomach in knots. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I needed to get back to camp. When I returned, Alex was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. His tent was empty, the fire was dying, and the place felt completely abandoned. Panic set in. I called out for him, but my voice echoed into the dark woods, swallowed by the vast silence. I didn't wait long. I grabbed my gear and ran. Whatever was out there, whatever had been stalking us, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I don't know how I made it out of those woods that night. My legs were shaking, and my heart felt like it might explode. But I kept running, pushing through the underbrush, knowing I needed to get to safety. By the time I reached the road, the sun was beginning to rise. My phone had no service, and I couldn't even remember the way back to town. But I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that place. It took hours before I finally stumbled upon a small gas station, and from there I managed to hitch a ride back to the nearest town. I never went back to that campsite, and I never heard from Alex again. The police searched the area, but they never found any trace of him. They said he must have wandered off, but I know better. Something, or someone, was out there watching us. And whatever it wasn't done with me yet. It had been one of those days where the weather couldn't make up its mind. The morning had started calm enough, with a mix of sunshine and clouds scattered in the sky. By the afternoon, however, the wind started picking up, and dark clouds rolled in from the west. I didn't mind. I had always liked the rain, especially in the woods. Something about the way the trees rustled and how the earth smelled when it got soaked made me feel at peace, or at least that's what I thought. I had decided to take a solo camping trip to the Chattahoochee National Forest near Helen, Georgia. It wasn't far from home, just a few hours' drive, but it was enough to feel disconnected from everything. I wanted the quiet, the solitude, and just a weekend to clear my head. The drive there had been uneventful. Narrow, winding roads flanked by dense woods and the occasional glimpse of a creek or a waterfall. I arrived at the campsite just as the first raindrops started falling. I set up my tent. A small one-man, easy to put up and take down. The ground was soft from previous rain, and the air felt thick like it was holding its breath. The sound of the rain hitting the trees and the ground was almost soothing. But there was something off. Maybe it was the silence of the forest around me, or the way the trees swayed ominously in the wind. Regardless, I dismissed the feeling, chalking it up to my mind playing tricks on me. By nightfall, the rain had picked up, coming down in sheets. I lit a small campfire under a shelter I had built with some logs and a tarp. The crackling of the fire was a welcome sound against the storm. I could barely hear the occasional gust of wind or the heavier raindrops pounding against the tarp. As I sat there watching the flames dance, I thought about how peaceful everything was. The world felt like it had slowed down. It was just me and the forest. Nothing else mattered. My mind wandered, thinking about life back home, the usual stress of work, bills, and everything else. It felt good to be far from it all, surrounded by the woods. But that sense of peace didn't last long. A strange noise broke through the rain, coming from the woods to the east. It wasn't the normal sounds of the forest. I had heard animals before, deer, squirrels, the occasional owl, but this was different. It sounded like something heavy was moving through the underbrush. I tried to convince myself it was just a bear or a large deer, but the noise didn't stop. It kept moving closer, and the sound was too deliberate, too heavy, to be a typical forest animal. I stood up, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the thick curtain of rain and trees. The noise, however, was unmistakable. It was getting closer. I quickly checked the area around my camp. Everything seemed in place, but my senses were on high alert now. I grabbed a large stick from beside the fire and held it close, just in case. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was out there, watching me. The wind howled and the rain intensified. It was almost as if the storm itself was trying to drown out the sound of whatever was moving in the woods. I kept my eyes fixed on the darkness beyond my camp, my heartbeat quickening with every passing second. The noise stopped for a moment, and in the eerie silence, I thought I heard something else. A faint rustling sound, like something stepping carefully over the wet ground, moving around my camp. I wasn't sure how long I stood there listening, but then the noise came again, closer this time. It was unmistakable. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and moving in a way that wasn't natural. My hand tightened around the stick, and I debated whether to confront whatever it was or stay hidden in my tent. The rational part of me told me to be still and wait for the storm to pass, but something told me that waiting wouldn't solve anything. I made my decision. I moved silently toward the tent, trying not to make a sound, and slipped inside. The rain poured harder, a loud, relentless patter on the fabric above me. My breathing felt loud in the small space, and I tried to control my racing heart. I pulled the zipper shut and waited. Minutes passed, maybe more. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and my mind raced, wondering what could be out there. I tried to convince myself it was just another camper, lost or seeking shelter, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The rain wasn't letting up. The wind blew harder. The trees creaked and groaned under the pressure. But just as I began to let my guard down, a loud crack split the night air. A branch had broken somewhere off to the side. The noise was so close it sent a jolt of fear through me. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, scanning the darkness outside my tent. There was no sign of movement, no animals, no people. But something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The wind shifted, and I heard it again. This time it was closer, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating only the wet earth and trees. But then, just at the edge of the light, I saw something. A figure. It was tall, much taller than a normal person. The shape was hunched, as if trying to stay out of the light, but it was unmistakable. My heart slammed against my chest. The figure was moving slowly, deliberately, toward the campsite. It wasn't the wind or an animal. This was something else. I snapped the zipper shut, breathing heavily, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My mind raced. Should I pack up and leave? But it was already too late. Whoever or whatever was out there had already seen me. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and I froze. I had no way of knowing what this thing wanted or what it might do. I could hear the soft, wet crunch of leaves and dirt under its feet. It was close now, right outside the tent. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, praying that it would go away. But it didn't. The footsteps stopped, and there was complete silence. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, every muscle in my body tense, ready to spring into action if I had to. But nothing happened. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of something moving away, slowly, steadily. The footsteps receded, fading into the distance. I didn't dare move or even breathe until the sound of the footsteps was completely gone. I stayed in the tent for the rest of the night, too afraid to go out, too afraid to even check if it was gone. The rain continued to pour, the storm only adding to the eerie atmosphere around me. The figure, whatever it was, had vanished into the woods, leaving me alone in the dark, wet forest. By morning, the storm had passed and the sun had begun to break through the clouds. The woods were quiet again and the air smelled fresh, damp with rain. I stepped out of the tent, scanning the area around me. There was no sign of anything unusual, no footprints, no signs of movement. Everything looked normal. I packed up quickly, not wanting to stay in the same spot any longer. As I left the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched the entire night. Something had been out there with me, something that was not human. It had stayed hidden in the rain, watching, waiting. I left the forest with a sense of unease, telling myself I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been out there, and it wasn't the storm. It had been something else, something that would haunt me long after I left the woods behind.